Hello, thanks for watching my presentation. I'm Dan Hickey. I'm a professor and a program coordinator with the Learning Sciences program at Indiana University in Bloomington. I'm going to talk about work that I'm doing today with two PhD students, Grant Chartrand and Morgan Lowe. This presentation was made at the Purdue AI and P-12 Education Conference on November 10th, 2025. Today I'll be talking about work carried out at Indiana University High School online. Many thanks to Rebecca Etu, the principal of IUHS and currently Assistant Vice Provost for School Partnerships and my former PhD advisee. Much of this work was initiated uh, with a grant from the Indiana Department of Education from the U.S. Department of Education, well-rounded education grants. These are funds that came through the governor's emergency education relief program during the pandemic. I'd also like to acknowledge Kyle Beiersdorf, my newest member of my lab at IU, who's contributed to this work as well. So today we'll be talking about what I call everyday assessment. This used to be called classroom assessment, but this is no longer really an accurate description since most assessments are carried out online using a learning management system or Google Forms, or even in conventional in-person classrooms. Um, Many educators and designers really struggle with assessment. There's issues like the validity concerns with traditional tests. A lot of people are very skeptical of multiple choice items, but then they discover that alternatives such as performance and portfolio assessment can be incredibly laborious both for students and teachers and often aren't very trustworthy. Teaching to the test remains just a hellacious problem in the assessment realm. Um, Most educators struggle to create effective items. They really struggle with the idea of transfer um, and ensuring that their items capture transfer um, in all formats. And in multiple choice formats, the so-called best answer items that professional item writers typically create that really get at deeper understanding rather than surface level recognition. Most educators really struggle to create those items, and all educators typically find it very tedious. I mean, it's just no fun creating items. And I certainly believe that formative assessment really hasn't lived up to its promise. It's incredibly laborious to give individualized feedback. Teachers and designers struggle to align formative and summative assessments, and I certainly agree with Bennett's argument that the effect size associated with formative assessment, commonly believed to be effective, is really an educational urban legend. Um, the point is that all the time that you spend, students completing formative assessments and educators grading them and giving them feedback, well, that has to be more effective than what it replaces. And I believe because of teaching to the test and performance assessment formats, it's often not. It's often educators spending an awful lot of time training students to solve a relatively specific kind of problem. So my work throughout my career, really since my days at the ETS Center for Performance Assessment, where I completed a postdoctoral fellowship, have been spent really applying newer theories of learning, particularly situated theory, to addressing these concerns. So during my postdoc, I really began exploring how situative theory could help us with this notion of alignment across different levels, increasingly formal levels of instruction, formative assessment, and summative testing. I first explored this in a chapter with my advisor, Jim Pellegrino, in 2005. Um, and drawing on my work at ETS, I spent really about 10 years really exploring this issue of alignment, collaborating with leading developers of multimedia and computer-based learning. Um, and I transitioned to online learning in 2008. I suspect many of you in this room had the same experience that I had over the holiday break 2022. Um, this article in the Atlantic Monthly really made me realize that things were going to be very, very different in assessment in particular, in education with the release of ChatGPT. But right away we see this ongoing debate between, the fears and the opportunities began. And that debate is certainly continuing to this day. So I want to wade into that debate in this presentation, as well as a in-revision paper that's currently in revision at Assessment and Education, and this broader program of research. I'd like to describe this promising synergy between generative AI, I use ChatGPT, this multi-level assessment system that I've been calling participatory learning and assessment that emerged in my work, and then modern learning management systems. Um, I want to exploit this synergy to really relieve educators and designers of the burden of creating and scoring assessments and help them align learning across these different levels. In doing so, I want to help educators minimize teaching to the test and really respond to this very real threat of GenAI powered cheating on summative tests. So the sort of the latest version of this, what again I'm calling it PLA, participatory learning and assessment, has emerged really in my own online teaching, particularly in two graduate courses. These are online asynchronous graduate courses, Learning and Cognition in Education and Assessment in Schools. Now, the nature of these courses, especially assessment in schools, naturally lend themselves and give me a lot of room to experiment. The students don't mind as much because I can connect what I'm playing around with in my class with what they're learning in my classes. So we first published this idea that we called participatory learning and assessment in 2013. Now my work is very strongly based on the design principles out of Randy Engel's work, initially based on productive disciplinary engagement or PDE, and later really transformed with the addition of expansive framing. This is a situative framework for transfer that followed Engel's situative theory of engagement. This approach essentially aligns learning across four or more increasingly formal levels, and I'm going to return to those levels as we go. But over the years, I've been doing quite a bit of experimentation in my class and writing about it quite a bit and publishing that research. So let me give you a little bit of context for this collaboration between IU Learning Sciences and Indiana University High School. So IUHS maintained its NCAA accreditation in the face of many, many shutdowns in 2014 of the degree mills like BYU Online because they had rigorous written exams that were completed under the guise of a human proctor, typically local librarians. Rebecca Ito completed her dissertation in 2015 to 2018. She really nicely adapted in a series of really design-based studies to adapted the framework that had emerged in my graduate courses to the IUHS context. And this is called a responsive engagement framework. And again, Rebecca was hired as principal in 2019. So IUHS gradually replaced the human proctors with Examity digital proctors starting in 2018 when IU contracted with them. Now, IUHS suspended Examity in most courses in 2022 when IU canceled the contract, and around the same time, IUHS accreditors also recommended getting rid of the digital proctors. Well, this creates a huge challenge. Is um, how do we manage without these proctors? With how do we be sure that students are in fact accomplishing what they appear to be accomplishing in these courses, especially um, with the ease with which students can search for answers in Google on online tests? So Morgan Lowe's early inquiry project uh, started tackling this problem with what we've called a completion-based alternative in 2022, really adding some things that I had been refining in my online courses. She added reflections, informative and summative self-assessments to assignments and modules in the introduction to the computer science course. Now, one thing we know from this is it took her all summer to create those items. It's really, really hard, even when you have content knowledge. It's just a lot of work to create all of these assessments that we've proposed. Um, Now, Morgan's initial research has showed that students really completed the assessments as intended. She's currently using discourse analysis to document the productivity and the disciplinarity of the engagement around those assessments. But in the middle of all this, everything changed on November 30th when ChatGPT was released, right? Because it's impossible. We had been using time-limited multiple choice exams that students really couldn't search for the answers in the time provided. And that was just completely obliterated with ChatGPT. So right now we're in the midst of really a phase two of this work. Grant Chartrand is using generative AI to revise the U.S. history and personal finance and banking courses, um, using the curriculum maps to create open and informative self-assessments, summative self-checks, um, low-stakes summative exams. Now, we're not using the Quick Check LTI tool. Some of you may have seen this. I use University Information Technology Services to develop this. One of the things we've really been doing a lot is experimenting with the different item formats that are available in Kansas, and we've concluded that you can really do quite a bit with even with the classic quiz format in Canvas and all other learning management systems. Now, one of the points about this current round of work is aiming to avoid sort of what Rebecca calls content drift, as content moves away from the targeted standards and objectives. Now, along the way, we're really dealing with some key questions. We're piloting now, and we hope that Grant will be able to explore these questions in his dissertation. So, for example, open-ended versus multiple choice items, they have different formative functions. They both can be used formatively. Then there's a question of optional versus mandatory. When you're doing self-assessments, right, you can, in my graduate courses, they're optional, but it's easy to make them mandatory by not allowing a student to move forward until they've completed them, even if they're not graded. Now, when you do get to multiple choice items, you have the choice of making them mandatory, or you can make them auto-graded. Now, when you do that, do you give students points for completing them? Do you give students points for how many they get right? A lot of open questions that need to be answered in this work. And then the question is this what I'll say a lot more about, which is whether you're using proximal items that are oriented to the curriculum, or whether you're using distal items that are oriented to standards, or some sort of hybrid in between. So in what follows, I'm going to use new items. These are not the items that Grant is working on now in class, because I really want to illustrate some key points and how this works. So I've chosen to use the U.S. History course. This is one of the two courses Grant's working on, and I'm going to focus on Module 3, which is on the Cold War. This chapter assigns students 2 chapters from an open source U.S. history text, 52 post-war challenges, and 53 happy days. Now, there's 3 Indiana State history standards that we've targeted. I'll return to these in a bit. So one of the features of the IUHS courses, like many courses, is that they have course objectives. These are phrased as I can statements. Right there you see, I'm going to focus on that first one. I can explain and analyze changing relations between the United States and the Soviet Union from 1960 to 1980. So what we're talking about today is creating and aligning proximal, distal, and hybrid items using GAI and using them in a learning management system in a way that promises to minimize GAI-powered cheating. So these levels are widely recognized by assessment scholars. Proximal items are curriculum-oriented, and they're based on the readings and the resources. In contrast, distal items are one level removed. They're standards-oriented because they're aligned to external standards. Now, IUHS features I can statements. These are essentially module objectives. These, in one sense, complicate the distinction, but on the other hand, as I'll show you, when they're used in hybrid items, they can really solve some big problems. So these items can be both open-ended and multiple choice. Both of them can be used formatively at all levels. I'll return to that point. What we're really aiming for here is what we call a completion-based response to academic integrity concerns. So if you appropriately align learning across these levels, that's going to motivate engagement and feedback while still requiring transfer from one level to the next. If we get it right, that promises to make it easier to learn than to cheat. So in what follows, I'm going to show how we use GenAI to create 6 different item types that instructors might choose from. Now, most instructors wouldn't want to use all of these, but I want to show you that they have different functions and different affordances. Generally speaking, we're going from more informal and proximal to more formal and distal across these items. So again, a proximal item is one that is curriculum oriented, and this is because they're directly derived from the curriculum. They're closer to the curriculum. So in this case, you need to link to the content If it's on the web, you can provide a link. You can also upload or cut and paste the content. You have quite a few options there and quite a few platforms, but it pretty much works the same in all platforms. You do need to be concerned about uploading copyrighted material to a open large language model. You can play around with prompts as needed. You can say, now make them harder, now make the explanations more detailed. This is something that really comes with practice. But the bottom line is that all AI platforms, and especially ChatGPT, are astonishingly good at creating items that you request. They can easily identify the big ideas in a chapter, and they're very good at creating expert answer explanations that almost always will go beyond what the students will write. Um, these items are easily administered. I use a Canvas ungraded survey, as I'll show you. So here's the actual prompt that I used. Generate 10 open-ended formative assessments and detailed answer explanations. And ChatGPT dutifully does so. It identified that this was a big idea in this question and provided a pretty solid answer explanation. And importantly, it also linked back to the chapter. That's because that's what we provided. And this is one of the features of ChatGPT is it'll often locate additional supplemental resources, as I'll show you. But in this case, it just linked back to the actual chapter. So we've played around with the wording uh, around these questions and what to call them. We've called them ungraded self-checks. We tell students you should be able to write an acceptable answer if you completed the assignment that this is associated with. If you can write little or nothing, search for information on the web or course resources. But most importantly, carefully compare your answer with the expert answer. There you can see a fairly likely response from a student, and you can see again how much further it's gone. We've done a little bit of reformatting to move that reference of the chapter to the end of the explanation. It's these so-called hybrid items that I think have really tremendous potential. In this case, we've taken that same prompt, but we've added for this objective. This is one of the I can statements: explain and analyze changing relations between the United States and the Soviet Union. And then but now contextualize that standard within the chapter. So there you can see the question gets a little more sophisticated. How did relations shift? It gives a pretty detailed explanation, but if you'll notice there in red, it goes beyond the content and into that standard or that objective. You should explain both why the shift happened, nuclear stalemate, domestic pressure, and how it was manifested, summits, treaties, right? So this is what I mean by going beyond a little bit. Notice how the explanation really goes beyond the content of the chapter, and importantly, it provides a link there to an outside resource that an attentive student might go to. And I should say that Indiana University High School serves a very diverse range of students, from credit recovery students all the way to diplomats, children and stuff who travel and things like that. So it's really, there are some very ambitious students that are aiming to get into very competitive universities, and it's not unreasonable to expect that they would go in and look for additional information. So, right, so they would ask themselves, so you should explain both why the shift happened and how it was manifested. That student might follow that link. In this case, it's to an additional reading timeline of U.S. and Russian relations, and there indeed you can see a really nice account of the events that happened during that time, again, that go beyond what was in the chapter. So the third item type I'll demonstrate is a multiple choice item. Now, I've changed a bit in my thinking about this over my career. I previously was fairly against spending a lot of time giving formative feedback or using multiple choice items formatively, but I've really changed my tune some. I'm now convinced that they have a lot of potential to help students form these sort of more general analogies that are likely necessary for knowledge to confidently transfer. So a theorist characterized this as generative learning. That's the kind of learning that generalizes or transfers readily to future educational settings, as in Bransford's preparation for future learning, but also into future workplaces and personal settings. So there you can see my prompt for this one: generate 10 multiple choice items for this objective. Right, so this is just that same objective that we used before, but now this is removed from the curriculum. So it's going to ask a little more general, possibly something that really wasn't deeply discussed. And so there you can see the item. Now it says, which event in 1962? That's a pretty specific item. Most students are going to come away from that chapter knowing that the Cuban Missile Crisis happened in 1962. This is what I mean by engineering the prompts. Make them harder, right? It remembers what you asked. All these platforms will remember. So you can just say, make them harder and make some of the answers partially correct. Now, these are these so-called best answer items that professional item writers typically write, and that I'm now convinced really can very efficiently help students understand that sort of deeper underlying question, ideas associated with an objective. So which statement best characterizes U.S.-Soviet relations immediately? Right, so see, this goes a little further. The correct answer is B. The direct conflict declined, but competition. Right, now it explains why A is partially correct. Now, you might not think that ChatGPT and other platforms tend to do this. It said both nations fully trusted each other. Now, you might choose to make that item a little harder by dropping the fully and changing the feedback. So distal items, again, are standards oriented. Um, Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, there are indeed three state standards associated with this particular module. Now, the important point about distal items is that they really can be valid evidence of likely transfer because they're so removed from the curriculum. But this is only if those items have not been directly taught to. And in this case, right there, you install them in your learning management system. You don't modify your curriculum to target them. Um, Now, such items are usually necessary for making claims about achievement because achievement tests are also standards oriented and sort of randomly associated with various curricula. Now, this is really crucial in contexts like math and English language arts because students face these kinds of tests and teachers are often held accountable for their performance. And so these kinds of items are usually necessary if you want to know whether student achievement is indeed going to transfer to externally developed tests. Now, they can be problematic in some disciplines, as I'll show you. So in this case, generate 10 open-ended formative self-assessment and answer explanations for this high school history standard. Right, so that's the standard that I showed you earlier. Analyze multiple unexpected and complex causes and effects of events in the past. Right, so this is now ignoring the curriculum and just going directly to the standard. So this item is indeed problematic. It really wouldn't work as a self-assessment. It might work in a teacher formative assessment and a teacher driven, but we're really aiming here for these self-assessments that make sense in an online or even in an in-person setting in terms of supplemental information and supplemental learning that students can engage in without burdening the teachers in any way. Right, so just look at this one. It really wouldn't work in this case. The student would have to sort of make something up, and then they'd have to score it with a rubric. It just, no. So let's try again. So we can address this problem with another hybrid item. So in this case, we go ahead and include the topic, right, the I can statement, which narrows the item, but it still has this really broad and challenging standard of analyzing multiple unexpected and complex causes and effects. And again, this is a challenge that most educators would find really, really difficult, and all educators would find quite tedious to develop a bunch of these items. And again, this is no problem for generative AI. You see, with just minor prompting and thinking, and with some content expertise, we're able to generate exceptional items that really serve this dual purpose of building on the curriculum, but that are removed enough from the curriculum that are likely to result in further learning that's likely to transfer more readily, assuming that students engage with the answer explanation. Now, remember that attempting to complete the item, right, the students are required to submit something before they can see the answer explanation. That really primes most students. Now, some students, yeah, they're just going to breeze through it. And there are other strategies. You can, for example, look at the answers that students complete. You can go in and make sure that students, or even individual students or all students, are writing a coherent response. And you can use that information to judge your practices around these. There's various strategies. I don't think we have time to get into too many of them, but as I mentioned at the beginning, the open questions are, you know, do you give students points, for example, for completing their submissions, right? If you just make them optional, some students really are not going to take them seriously. But if you give students points towards their grade for submitting something, they're likely to submit something more thoughtful and spend more time thinking for the answer. The more time that they spend thinking on their own, the more they're mentally primed to make sense of this answer. In other words, they've generated, that's an interesting question. And so the more curious you've made them with the question, because it sort of really did go beyond the curriculum, the more likely they are to engage more deeply with the answer explanation and again form these more general analogies around these standards that's likely to transfer to future learning settings. Now, one of the big advantages of multiple choice items is that they're quicker, right? You can administer far more of them and the amount of time. I think that some empirical research is needed at this point to really study this question. I'm currently seeking funding to explore them more deeply, but let's look at what happens when we create a distal multiple choice item from the standard. Um, right, so notice I've said independent of topics. Now, you'll learn that ChatGPT might or might not remember what you were doing. So when you say independent of topics, it generates an item that is indeed independent. So I'm just constantly astonished at how clever generative AI is at generating these kinds of items. Because I said independent of topic, it really went to this general historian's use of complex causal analysis. Um, Now that item is probably pretty easy for most students in this situation, but if you look at these other answers, they're pretty A, C, and D are really all very specific responses compared to B. So B is naturally the answer. Now, I still think that a student in this setting is going to learn something useful from this. And notice at the bottom it says strong students recognize, right? So it's reinforcing this point. But now a simple pivot with this item says using events that are familiar to most American high school students, right? So this is going to contextualize it with something that's likely to be familiar. So here you see this item. Now again, this is a challenge that I've noticed, particularly with ChatGPT. That item's really a little too easy. A student uh, could identify the correct answer simply from the wording alone. So again, we just prompt it, make them harder. So even with this version, if you look at answer C, um, it begins suddenly with no long-term tensions. And so that's really kind of a giveaway. That's really not a very good foil. So you might want to come in and just revise the item. So in the case of C, we just said it began after longer term tensions. So that item is technically correct, but it's not as accurate as B. And so this is a way that I'm convinced now, after really 20 years of teaching educators to write high quality items in my assessment in schools course, that I really think that there's a lot of learning can happen here, right? It gets you partway there. Um, this is one of these ways that ChatGPT and other GenAI platforms give what Ethan Mollick called cheap variation, right? So you can just get multiple versions, and teachers can learn these nuances in a way that just sort of happens sort of more organically. I think a little bit of training. Certainly, I've learned that in my class, I'm now adding optional AI elements to every assignment to help students learn to use AI in the fashion I'm showing here. But I think there's a lot of learning that can just happen here by generating these example items and looking them over carefully. And again, these are very, very difficult items for humans to write. Even, skilled professional item writers, it takes a long time to write these, and then they still might not be that good. So again, as someone who's been teaching educators for many years about assessment, I think there's some enormous potential here for professional learning. Um, Right, just by going through these. So, for example, construct relevant easiness, so-called teaching to the test. Many educators really compromise their assessments by, for example, referencing counterexamples in their lectures that also uses foils in their items. Now, because of the human brain, it has unlimited long-term memory capacity for this so-called recognition level learning. So mere exposure to the associations without any deeper processing allows students to recognize correct and incorrect associations on items if they've been exposed to those associations in the curriculum. And so this leads to this really problematic construct of relevant easiness it's often difficult to detect. I think that this process that I've just demonstrated, and especially with some guidance, um, really helps them appreciate what that means. I also think that this is going to help educators balance credibility, the sort of face validity, and actual validity in terms of evidence of achievement. Now, one of the issues here is that formative and summative items, they must be similar enough to motivate student engagement, right? So when students get to their first formative assessment, they need to recognize that this is extending, going a little beyond what they learned, but they need to be able to, it needs to be familiar enough for them to readily uh, write down a semi or correct response and then engage with the formative feedback. But the items must be different enough to require some degree of transfer for meaningful learning to occur. Now, ChatGPT 4 was not really good at generating items and deliberately generating item pairs, formative and summative items that were sufficiently different. But I've been astonished that when students are doing their own assessment, this is a different presentation, but it turns out that ChatGPT and other platforms are very good at contextualizing um, items in what I would call personal authenticity, like drawing on the student's own experiences, right? The students provide some information about themselves and then provide the content and say, assess the big ideas as they relate to me. And in a separate talk, I've talked about this quite a bit now, that ChatGPT is exceptionally good at, students saying, okay, now assess my knowledge of these in general and more different contexts. And ChatGPT 5 understands that quite clearly. So let me wrap this up by revisiting the key questions, right? The obvious ones are open-ended versus multiple choice, as I hope you appreciate now. They have different affordances. One of the big advantages of the multiple choice items is that they can be automatically scored. You have quite a few options of how to do this. Um, you can have the students, for instance, you can still treat it as an open-ended item and have the students look at the answer explanation to see whether or not they got it correct. You can give different kinds of feedback for different responses. You really have a lot of options. These learning management systems are very, very powerful quiz engines. Um, the real tough ones are optional versus mandatory self-assessments. On the open-ended ones, again, you can force students to put something down before they can see the answers, and you can require students to complete that assessment before they can move through the unit. Um, Now, when you get into multiple choice items, which can be automatically graded, you have a lot of decisions to make there as well. And then finally, you've got this question of proximal versus distal versus hybrid items. Many of these questions can be answered just using sort of iterative refinement, just looking and seeing what your students are doing, seeing are they indeed providing answers. You can look at timestamps and see how much time students are spending. Now, Morgan Lowe is in the middle of our early inquiry project looking at these assumptions and generally speaking, in the Introduction to Computer Science course, students were indeed um, uh, answering the questions that they were intended, and we're currently analyzing the actual responses in terms of their learning. And these are some questions that we hope to be pursuing in this next round of research at Indiana University High School. So thank you very much for listening to my presentation. Email me if you have questions, dthickey@iu.edu. Our blog, Remediating Assessments, a little out of date right now, but we'll probably get some of this work up there again soon. Now we have a lengthy manuscript that describes this process in some detail that's currently in revision for assessment and education. We hope to have that out soon. So thanks a lot.